The rain had already begun when Claire pulled into the gravel driveway of the cabin. It wasn't the sharp, pelting kind of storm, but a steady curtain of water that dulled the world into shades of gray. The wipers dragged across her windshield with a tired squeak, barely keeping up. She sat there for a moment, engine idling, staring at the cabin she'd booked online. The photos had promised rustic charm and solitude. What she saw was a slouched silhouette of wood, leaning just enough to feel wrong, like it had been waiting too long for someone to come back. She cut the engine. The sudden silence, broken only by the rain, felt louder than the motor had. Grabbing her bag, she dashed up the steps, noticing that the porch light flickered once before dying altogether. She laughed softly under her breath, the way people do when they don't want to admit a place unsettles them. The key was supposed to be under a ceramic frog by the door. She found the frog, but the key beneath it was slick with grime, as though it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something metallic, like rust or blood that had dried long ago. She told herself it was just the pipes. The living room was dim, the windows streaked with rain and fogging at the corners. An old rocking chair sat pointed toward the front door, as if whoever had last been here was waiting for her. Claire turned on her phone's flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The shadows stretched, bent, and recoiled like things with a mind of their own. She tried the lamps. None of them worked. The only reliable light came from the occasional flash of distant lightning, brief pulses that lit the room in harsh whites and deep blacks. Claire set her bag down and forced herself to breathe. She reminded herself she had come for peace. No city noise, no calls from work, no distractions. Just her, the rain, and silence. But silence, she realized, had its own weight. It pressed in, waiting for her to notice what was missing inside it. Then came the sound. At first, she thought it was the rain slipping into a new rhythm. But it wasn't. It was faint, deliberate, the creak of a floorboard upstairs. Claire froze, her body still but her pulse thundering. She tried to dismiss it. Old wood, the storm, her imagination. But the sound came again, slower this time, as if someone was moving carefully, testing each step to avoid being heard. She whispered into the empty air, "This place is supposed to be vacant." The storm outside gave no answer. Claire's phone flashlight shook in her hand as she aimed it toward the staircase. The beam caught the first 3 steps, worn smooth in the middle by countless feet, but dissolved into blackness beyond. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, maybe with swelling in the damp air. Still, the sound had a rhythm, too deliberate to ignore. She whispered again, "Hello?" But her voice came out thinner than she expected, almost swallowed by the steady rain pressing against the walls. The silence that followed was worse than a reply. She waited, heart hammering, for another creak. Instead, she noticed something else, a draft, cold and damp, drifting down from above. It smelled faintly of mildew and something else she couldn't place, sharp, acrid, almost metallic. The cabin's listing had promised a fully renovated loft space, but in this moment, she wondered if the upstairs had been touched at all in years. The smell clung to her throat, making it hard to swallow. Her mind darted to the reason she'd booked the place in the first place. Work had chewed her down to bone and nerve. She hadn't taken a real break in 3 years. The cabin's photos had promised peace, a place to read and sleep and finally breathe. Her friends had teased her for wanting to spend her vacation alone in the woods, but Claire thought solitude sounded like salvation. Yet standing there now, flashlight aimed at those black stairs, solitude had never felt heavier or more dangerous. The rain intensified, as if encouraging her not to leave, drowning the road in mud and noise. She thought of grabbing her bag and sprinting back to the car. But the rocking chair at her back, its silent, motionless weight, made the idea of turning away unbearable. Something about the chair, about the way it had been angled toward the door, made her feel like it had been waiting for her specifically. A place set for her arrival. A watcher she hadn't invited. Then the sound came again, louder, more distinct. Not a creak this time, but a drag. Something heavy shifting across a wooden floor directly above her head. Claire's breath caught. She tightened her grip on her phone until her knuckles ached, her flashlight beam trembling across the staircase. She told herself to run, to get out, but her legs remained rooted. And then, In the space between thunderclaps, a whisper floated down from the loft, so soft she almost doubted it. Her name, stretched and broken. Claire. For a long moment, Claire stood frozen in the living room, staring at the staircase as if it were a throat about to swallow her whole. The whisper of her name still clung to the air, soft but undeniable, echoing in her chest. She told herself it must have been her imagination, a trick of rain and nerves. Yet her body knew better. Her arms prickled with goose flesh, her pulse beating so loud it almost drowned out the storm. She slowly backed away from the staircase until her knees brushed the coffee table. The flashlight's beam jittered across the warped wallpaper, over shelves lined with dust-caked trinkets, ceramic birds, a faded globe with continents chipped at the edges, a stack of brittle magazines curled from moisture. None of it matched the glossy online photos. She realized then that the cabin she thought she had rented wasn't the same cabin she had walked into. The air grew heavier, wetter, as though the rain outside was somehow seeping inside the walls. She turned toward the kitchen, hoping to find a breaker box or maybe just a working lamp. The tiles there were cracked, pale gray lines spreading like veins. The sink dripped steadily, though the faucet was turned off, each drop echoing into the silence. When she touched the counter, the surface was clammy, sticky almost, as if someone had just been standing there with wet hands. She pulled her phone out of her pocket, checked for service. Nothing. No signal, no bars, just the faint glow of 23% battery left. Panic nipped at the edge of her thoughts, but she tried to steady herself with logic. Old cabins had noises. Old cabins had drafts. Old cabins had quirks. But they didn't normally know your name. She thought of the whisper again, rolling it over in her mind. The voice hadn't sounded human exactly. It had carried a breathy rasp, like someone who hadn't spoken in years. The fresh sound made her whip her head back toward the living room. The rocking chair, moving. Not rocking wildly, just a single, deliberate shift, the wooden runners scraping softly against the floorboards. Claire's throat closed. She hadn't touched it, hadn't gone near it. For the first time since arriving, she whispered to herself, "I shouldn't be here." And somewhere above her head, a slow, dragging step answered. Claire's hand hovered over the banister, her flashlight beam trembling against the first steps. Every sensible part of her screamed to leave, to abandon her bag, to brave the storm and find a motel hours down the road. But curiosity, mixed with something harder to name, rooted her in place. The sound of that dragging step above had been deliberate. If she fled now, she knew she'd spend the rest of her life wondering what it was. The banister was slick beneath her palm, as if moisture had seeped into the wood. She tested the first step. It groaned loudly, the noise ricocheting through the house like a warning. The second step followed with a softer creak. She paused, holding her breath, listening for the answering shuffle above. Nothing came. Only the rain against the roof and the faint drip of the kitchen sink. Yet the silence didn't comfort her. It felt staged, too neat, like the house was holding its breath too. Halfway up, her flashlight caught on the walls. They were papered in a pattern of faded ivy vines, curling toward the ceiling. But the water damage had twisted the design, bleeding the vines into shapes that looked disturbingly like figures. Bent, reaching, faces smeared into the pattern. She blinked hard, telling herself it was just mold. The more she looked, though, the more those warped vines seemed to lean toward her, their outlines sharpening when lightning flashed. She reached the landing, heart rattling against her ribs. The loft stretched out before her, open and bare, except for a low bed frame and a wardrobe with a warped mirror on its front. The mirror's glass was cloudy, darkened by age, but it caught the light enough to reflect her shape faintly. Claire steadied her breathing, sweeping the flashlight beam across the floorboards. Dust and cobwebs sprawled thick, untouched. Yet one long streak cut through the dust, a dragged line across the floor. Exactly where she'd heard that heavy sound, the streak led to the wardrobe. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The flashlight beam wavered over its handles, two brass rings dulled with tarnish. The mirror reflected her back at herself, fractured in the fogged glass. For a moment, she thought her reflection was delayed, her own movements slightly out of sync. She lifted the beam higher, squinting into the glass. Behind her reflection, faint but unmistakable, was another shadow. It stood just beyond her shoulder, where no one should be. Claire couldn't move at first. The mirror's cloudy surface wavered with her reflection, but that second shadow stood perfectly still. She told herself it was an illusion, the way light bent through dirty glass, but her gut churned with certainty. She lifted her phone higher, the weak beam crawling across the loft until it landed on the wardrobe itself. The tarnished brass rings looked like eyes, waiting. Her legs carried her forward in hesitant steps, each one creaking under her weight. She passed the bed frame, its mattress stripped bare, a nest of dust and mouse droppings where sheets should have been. The dragged streak in the floorboards seemed to grow deeper the closer she came to the wardrobe, almost gouged, as though something had been hauled inside. She reached out, fingers trembling, and touched the wood. It was cold, unnaturally cold, like the inside of a freezer. The mirror reflected her up close now, and she saw more than herself. Behind her shoulder, the shadow loomed larger, its edges blurred, as though smoke were taking the shape of a figure. Claire's breath fogged the glass when she leaned closer. For the briefest instant, she swore the reflection smiled, a curling grin that wasn't hers, stretching too wide. She stumbled back, her phone almost slipping from her hand. Lightning flashed, thunder shook the cabin, and Claire grabbed one of the brass handles. She yanked the wardrobe doors open. The smell hit first, a gush of stale, fetid air, laced with mold and something sickly sweet. Her flashlight cut through the dark interior. No coats hung there, no belongings. Just emptiness. The boards at the bottom were scuffed, raw, like claws had raked across them. And deep in the shadows, she saw it, a small handprint smeared in something dark, pressed against the wood. Before she could react, the doors slammed shut. Not from her touch, they wrenched inward with a violent snap, as if someone inside had pulled them closed. Her scream caught in her throat. The mirror rattled, dust falling from the wardrobe's top. Then, clear as breath against her ear, a whisper unfurled from the glass. "Don't open it again." Claire staggered back from the wardrobe, her shoulder slamming into the bed frame. The whisper still clung to her ear, as if the voice had seeped beneath her skin. She pointed her flashlight wildly, expecting something, someone, to step out from behind her. Nothing moved. The loft was still again, too still. She swallowed hard, her body trembling, and muttered, "Nope. I'm done. I'm out." She bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time. The rocking chair greeted her at the bottom, but this time it wasn't angled toward the stairs. It faced the front door. Claire's pulse spiked. She kept her eyes averted, refusing to give the chair the satisfaction of her attention. Her focus tunneled toward the door, her lifeline. The rain pounded outside, drowning the roof in its endless rhythm. Freedom was just one turn of the knob away. She grabbed the handle and twisted. It wouldn't budge. She pulled harder, jamming her shoulder against the wood. The door rattled but stayed sealed. Panic rushed through her veins. She checked the lock, unlatched. She kicked at the frame, but it held as if fused to the wall. Behind her, the rocking chair creaked softly. Claire froze, her breath heaving. The sound wasn't random. It was a slow, steady back and forth, like someone sitting there, watching. Her phone buzzed suddenly in her pocket. She fumbled it out, hope flaring, but the screen was black. Not dead, just black, as though the light itself had been swallowed. She pressed the power button again and again, but nothing came. The faint glow of the flashlight was gone. Only the storm offered flashes of light now, jagged and brief. And in each burst, the shadows in the room seemed to lean closer, longer, stretching toward her. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Not above this time. Not behind a mirror. They were in the living room with her, wet and deliberate, padding across the wooden floor. Claire's breath caught. She pressed herself against the door, trying to melt into it, every nerve screaming to run. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away. Then a voice, low, hoarse, and chillingly patient, broke through the dark. "You shouldn't have opened it." Claire pressed her palms harder against the door, as if sheer will could force it open. Her chest heaved, her lungs begging for air that felt thick and sour. The footsteps had stopped just beyond the reach of lightning's brief glow, but she could sense them, an awareness in the dark, patient, watching. She thought if she stayed still enough, maybe it would lose interest. Then the rocking chair gave a violent creak, snapping forward and back with sudden force. The sound cracked through the room like a warning shot. Her nerve broke. "Stay away from me," she shouted into the black. Her voice cracked, raw and thin against the roar of the storm. The silence that followed was worse than any reply. Then, slow and deliberate, something dragged across the wooden floor. Not footsteps this time. Something heavier, like hands or limbs pulling along. The sound grew closer, a scraping, desperate crawl that prickled her spine. Claire clenched her fists, shaking. If she couldn't leave, she'd face it. Lightning split the sky, and for a fraction of a second, she saw it. A figure crouched low in the middle of the room, its shape soaked and glistening as if it had risen dripping from a pond. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too bent, its face hidden in the black curtain of wet hair. But what froze her blood wasn't its body. It was the way its head tilted sharply at the crack of thunder, like a predator zeroing in on prey. And its mouth, just barely visible, was smiling. The light vanished as quickly as it came, plunging the cabin back into blackness. Claire's scream stuck in her throat. She staggered sideways, fumbling for anything, her bag, a weapon, even the useless phone. Her fingers landed on the fireplace poker leaning by the hearth. She grabbed it with both hands, the metal icy and rough. The scraping sound stopped. The presence was silent again, but the room felt full, the air electric with its nearness. Then the whisper came again, no longer distant, no longer playful. It rose from the floorboards themselves, from the walls, from every shadow pooling in the cabin. Claire, you opened the door. Now you have to stay. Her grip tightened on the poker, her knuckles white. She realized, with a shiver that cut to the bone, that the wardrobe hadn't just held a shadow, it had released it. And now, the cabin was no longer just haunted. It was inhabited. Claire's breath came in ragged bursts, her grip on the fireplace poker slick with sweat. The shadows writhed against the walls as though waiting for a command. She tightened her stance, shoulders squared, though her legs quivered beneath her. The silence pressed heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then came the scrape again, closer this time, circling her. Whatever crawled across the floor was faster than before, bolder, hungrier. She spun and swung the poker blindly. The iron whistled through the dark and struck something solid with a metallic crack. A shriek tore through the cabin, high, wet, and furious, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. Lightning flashed, and she saw it lurch back, its elongated arm twisted at an impossible angle where the poker had struck. But it didn't fall. Instead, it pressed its ruined limb against the boards, dragging itself forward, its grin stretched wider, teeth gleaming like shards of glass. Claire backed against the door, heart hammering. "Stay away," she shouted, though her voice shook. She swung again, catching only air this time. The creature darted in sudden bursts, like a flicker of bad film. Here, then gone, reappearing closer each time the lightning lit the cabin. It wasn't just moving, it was playing with her. The poker felt laughably small, a stick against something that should not exist. The rocking chair slammed backward against the wall, shattering wood. The noise made Claire jump, and in that distraction, the thing lunged. She thrust the poker out, jamming it into the creature's chest. For a heartbeat, they were locked there, her arms straining against its weight, its slick skin pressing cold against the iron. The grin hovered inches from her face. She gagged on its smell, like river mud and rot. Then, slowly, impossibly, it began to push the poker aside, bending her strength like it was nothing. The lights from the storm flickered one last time, and Claire caught a glimpse of its eyes, black, bottomless, hungry. And in those eyes, she saw herself. Not her reflection, but her future, trapped, hollow, another shadow in the cabin's walls. Her scream finally ripped free, echoing through the storm as the thing forced her backward against the door, whispering with a voice both mocking and certain, "No one leaves." The cabin's walls groaned, bowing inward as if they were breathing in time with the storm. Claire pressed harder against the door, her knuckles white around the poker. The figure stood only a few steps away, swaying slightly, its broken shoulder jutting at a grotesque angle. It didn't lunge. It didn't need to. It simply waited, as though it knew time was on its side. The heat of the door grew unbearable at her back. She flinched and stepped aside just as a crack split through the wood. A jagged seam glowing faintly from within. For a second, she thought fire was breaking through. But when she leaned closer, She saw something else, symbols carved into the wood, glowing faintly gold, like embers in ash. They hadn't been there before. Her pulse quickened. The house wasn't just alive. It was marked. The figure hissed when she touched the glowing seam, recoiling slightly, its grin faltering. For the first time, she felt power shift. The poker shook in her hand, but now she gripped it differently. Not as a weapon to swing wildly, but as something that might channel whatever the house had hidden inside its bones. She pressed the iron tip against the glowing carvings, and sparks leapt like tiny lightning bolts. The thing shrieked, the sound piercing, cracking glass in the window panes. The cabin bucked violently, throwing Claire to the floor. Dust cascaded from the rafters, furniture toppled, shadows writhed. The figure staggered, its limbs jerking like strings being cut. But even as it faltered, it laughed, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the boards. "Too late, Claire," it rasped. "The door isn't for leaving. The door is for keeping." She scrambled to her knees, poker in hand, staring at the glowing seam as it spread upward, the carvings brightening until the entire frame pulsed with light. The choice seared in her mind: press forward and force the door open, risking whatever keeping meant, or stay, fight, and maybe trap herself forever. The storm howled louder, urging her to decide, while the figure's long shadow stretched toward her, grinning wider still. The carvings on the door blazed brighter, lines of gold splitting across the warped wood like veins of fire. Claire pressed the poker deeper into the seam, her teeth gritted, every muscle in her arms screaming with effort. The entity shrieked again, its voice fractured into layers, half human and half something older, vibrating the very air. The cabin trembled with it, rafters cracking, windows bursting outward in shards of glass that vanished into the storm. The figure lurched toward her, its broken body twitching with fury. Each step left a black stain on the floorboards, as if the wood rotted beneath its weight. Claire shoved harder, and the seam split wider. Light seared through, not fire but something purer, colder. A wind rushed in, icy, relentless, snuffing out the smell of rot and pressing the entity back. For the first time, its grin faltered completely. Its eyes went wide, reflecting fear. The house roared, boards snapping like bones, as if it understood she had found its heart. The figure lunged, mouth yawning open, its jagged teeth glistening. Claire screamed and thrust the poker into the light. The door split wide with an explosion of brilliance, flooding the cabin. Shadows shrieked and tore away, peeling from the walls like burned paper. The figure collapsed mid-lunge, disintegrating into smoke that was ripped into the brightness, its grin the last to fade. The storm outside went silent. The rain, the thunder, even the wind fell away until the only sound was her ragged breathing. Claire staggered backward, blinking against the brilliance. The door, once sealed and rotting, now stood open. Beyond it, not the muddy driveway, not the forest, but a quiet, moonlit clearing. She stepped through without hesitation. The air was cool and clean, the grass damp beneath her shoes. When she turned back, the cabin was gone. Only trees remained, swaying gently in the breeze. Claire collapsed into the wet grass, clutching the poker like a lifeline. She watched the clouds break, a thin line of dawn bleeding across the horizon. For the first time since arriving, she felt silence without weight, solitude without dread. She had escaped, but the memory of the whisper clung to her still, a final echo carried on the wind. "We'll wait for you."